So I'm going to talk about health maintenance strategies in the wild, how wild animals keep themselves well, but I'm going to set it in the context of how you can help animals in your care. So this is all covered in my book Wild Health, but we'll bring it into relevance. So in the wild, animals have got to battle with a whole host of health hazards: internal parasites, skin parasites, poisons, getting wounded, and a whole host of pathogens the same as we do: bacteria, fungi, viruses, everything out to get them. But what's interesting is that of course all the plants in their environment are also under attack all the time from very similar pathogens. And so what you can get is a whole ecosystem where health management is embedded. And what I mean by that is that the plants will be producing compounds that protect them from local pathogens, and so eating those plants provides the animals with phytochemicals, plant chemicals that are designed to combat the local pathogens. So there's a locality issue, an ecosystem issue, and this is why I go so far as to say that health management is an entire ecosystem, or that health is embedded, it's interwoven into the environment. So in order to survive, the pressure that's been on wild animals is to stay as healthy as possible all the time. It's a completely different strategy than us humans, where we tend to wait until we get sick and then do something about it. So there isn't that option in the wild. In order to survive, you've got to be as healthy as possible at all times. And so most of their strategies for staying well are preventative, in that they are about taking little and often medicinal compounds in the nutrition, managing health on a daily basis by using non-nutritional substances such as clays, charcoals, fibres, small amounts of toxins that are bioactive, and keeping their fur, feathers and bedding in good condition by using antimicrobials, usually aromatics, but we'll talk about that in detail. So there's lots of preventative measures, lots of maintenance measures that are inbuilt into the behavioural repertoire of the animals. So one of these examples would be that deer prefer to nibble on plants that are normally quite astringent and quite off-putting for herbivores. I mean, plants produce substances that taste horrible in order to stop herbivores from eating them. But nibbling on these astringent compounds actually has loads of benefits. And the way this was discovered was that in New Zealand, they farm deer commercially, and they thought they were doing a very good job by having this lovely monoculture of gorgeous grass and the idea was that the grass would turn into meat as efficiently as possible. But what they found was that they were spending a lot of money on deworming the deer because they were getting a lot of worms. But when they allowed the pasture to get a few weeds, and they allowed the deer to nibble on what were considered weeds, that the need for deworming medication went down. It cost far less to keep them healthy because they were managing their own worm levels by nibbling on these astringent tannins. And there are lots of compounds in the wild that taste bitter, and so I'm labelling them bitters here, but plants produce bitter tasting compounds in order to put off herbivores, to stop herbivores from eating them. But they are often incredibly medicinal, incredibly bioactive. They have strong effects in the body. And nibbling little and often can be a way to manage some quite serious parasite problems. Now on the left here we've got a photograph of a chimpanzee, and this photograph taken by Michael Hoffman is the first recorded the first documentation of animal self-medication in the wild, where the animal has deliberately gone out and sought a plant that is non-nutritional, no nutrition value to them at all, and has only done it when they're sick, and has done it until they're no longer sick and then stops doing it. And this plant that the chimpanzee is using here, she was very sick and she travelled a great distance to find this particular plant, and then she carefully peeled off all the outer layers and got inside to the pith, and the pith is very, very bitter. And so this behaviour is called bitter pith chewing. And it's so toxic that it's known locally as goat killer, but it's also known by the local herbalists to cure all sorts of local illnesses that they have. Anyway, once this had been spotted as a self-medication strategy, the primatologists who were studying this group of chimpanzees kept an eye out for it, and they saw it 4 more times in the next 10 years. So it's rare. These behaviours are rare, and you've got to know what you're looking for. And if you didn't know what you were looking for, you would think this was just normal feeding behaviour. And the image I've got on the right there is just to show that insects also manage their internal parasites by nibbling on the bitter alkaloids that are in the plants that they have. If you change the concentration of bitters in their diet, their intestinal parasites are allowed to grow. Another strategy that's really common in the wild is geophagy, earth eating. Now, it isn't just eating topsoil, which is full of bacteria and harmful and full of feces and all sorts of nasties, but the digging down to subsoils, which are very safe, and particularly seeking out clay if possible. And clay has all sorts of medicinal benefits, one of which is that it will bind toxins that are in the plants that they eat. So it'll bind the toxic chemicals in plant medicines, and then they can just defecate it out. So it used to be assumed that this digging for clay was just a search for a particular mineral that they were missing in their environment. And sometimes digging is about mineral searching, as in a nutritional mineral. But if you look across a broad sweep across animal behaviour, you see that every species that eats plants also eats earth, as in clay. It also digs for clay. And the theory that it is about managing the inevitable consumption of plant toxins, that the plants are constantly producing chemicals to stop herbivores eating them, but herbivores have to eat them. And so one of the ways they manage that is to eat clay. And there are lots of stories of self-medication with clay digging. So here we got, just to show you that parrots, these are in the Amazon, and they flock to the riverbanks, and the riverbanks are wonderful sources of clay for the birds because they're sort of freshly eroded all the time, so it's nice access to safe subsoils, and they will feed on the clay every day because a lot of their diet is toxic. They have to, they're trying to get into seeds and crack open nuts and so on, and the plant is trying to stop them. So the plant's producing loads of toxins, and they manage those toxins by eating clay. So the other thing that's quite surprising for people when we talk about animal self-medication is the really common use of mechanical scours. So this is nothing to do with plant chemistry, nothing to do with the medicinal properties of plants, but literally using them like swallowing a scouring pad. And so here on the right, I've got a photograph, another one of Michael Huffman's photographs of a chimpanzee putting a leaf on her tongue, not picking the leaf, just testing the leaf. And they'll go around different trees, testing different leaves until they find a leaf that is of suitable texture. And then they will pick the leaf and fold it in a concertina fashion in one direction and then in the other direction. So it becomes like a little scouring pad. And the leaves they choose are all really rough leaves with little hooks all over them. And they swallow them whole. They don't eat them. So this behaviour is called leaf swallowing because they don't chew them. And when they come out the other end, they have nodule worms trapped in all the little folded Velcro-like hooks of the leaves that they've chosen. And it's in the wild we see bears and geese. So geese before migration, bears before hibernation, eating and swallowing really coarse grass and then defecating it out the other end, completely undigested in balls that are full of intestinal worms. And it's seen as a strategy for getting rid of worms before the long migration, getting rid of worms before you go into hibernation, because otherwise you won't wake up or you won't make it. So mechanical scours, and I've got a picture of the dog eating grass there because one of the theories about eating grass is that it's simply an undigestible material which can go through the gut and help, and it's a sign of gastrointestinal malaise. It's a sign that they feel they've got tummy upset. So we also see an awful lot of skin management, fur management, feather management, and a lot of this using bioactive compounds in the environment. So here I've got a picture of a bear, which is the only picture of a bear I could find. So it's not particularly illustrative of skin management, but they scratch against things, and they will prefer to scratch against things that are smelly, and the smelliness seems to be quite important because aromatic compounds are often antimicrobial. And what I've got, if we're sticking with fur management, I haven't got any images, but there's a famous, well-known example of capuchin monkeys who use the secretions from a local millipede. So they've got a millipede in their environment that when you go to touch it, it will squirt this venom at you, and that will stop you from picking it up. And obviously it will survive. So the capuchin monkeys have discovered that if they just delicately pick up the millipede so they don't hurt it, it will squirt out this oozy venom, and they can then rub that on their skin, and they don't kill the millipede, and they sort of pass it on and they share it around, and they all have a good rub with this toxic substance. And it must sting or burn or something because they start writhing around and sort of rolling all over each other. And it turns out that this does several things, this compound. It's very astringent, so it helps close up lots of little bites that they've got all over the skin. but it is also incredibly antimicrobial, and skin mites don't like it. So it's an all-round skin benefit for them. And we see this with birds as well, in that this is the common starling, and the common starling will go out and collect aromatics, like as smelly as possible, plants to stuff into their nest. And researchers studied the survival of chicks in nests with aromatic herbs, and in nests where the human researchers had removed the aromatic components and left everything else. And those chicks in nests with aromatic herbs had better survival rates. And when they looked at their blood, they analysed the blood of the chicks, they realised that the chicks without aromatics in their nests were getting fed on by feather mites in the nests, and the aromatics were keeping away, like a fumigation of the nest. And apparently badgers do this too, and we don't know how many other species are using aromatics to help fumigate their nests. So, really important point to take home is that we're not talking about an infallible wisdom here. So animals don't always know best. Even monkeys fall out of trees. Yeah. So even in the wild, they can poison themselves. They can get high on plants that are psychoactive and consequently injure themselves. They can gorge themselves. But what is interesting is that the opportunities for this, or the situations where this happens, are incredibly rare, and they're usually because something in the environment has changed. So I've got the example here of wild elephants, semi-wild elephants, getting drunk. But I mean, they're in a really artificial situation here, where they're in a monoculture, a human monoculture of plants that are getting them high, and they've just raided it. But they're not. We all know of examples where wildlife gets accidentally poisoned. So there are situations, but it's usually when they're interacting with humans in some way. But this observation of wild baboons, which was done by Robert Sapolsky many years ago now, and he wrote an article called Junk Food Monkeys. And what this illustrates is that there isn't an inherent kind of wisdom about how to stay healthy, but there are strategies that have evolved in context, in the environment in which they evolved. So wild baboons in the Masai Mara National Park, they spent normally 40% of every day struggling to find sufficient nutrients and energy to survive. But as tourism increased, the local hotels started to dump their waste regularly every morning in a certain spot. And the baboons learned that they didn't need to forage as normal. They could just hang out around the waste area and eat all the refuse from the humans living on a diet of junk food in the hotels. So they were eating burgers and God knows what. And then they could just lay around all afternoon. So they realised that they didn't need to forage. So they weren't being sensible about their health. It's a strategy for find as much salt, sugar and fat as you can, and then you'll be all right. And because salt, fat and sugar are rare in the wild, that strategy works. As soon as you put loads of salt, fat and sugar in front of them, they'll eat it, they get fat, they get sick, they get all the diseases and illnesses of modern humans. So, how do they know what to do, what to eat when they're sick? This is always a question that comes up. And as I say, there's an assumption that there's this kind of innate animal wisdom, and although it looks like that, it's much more about inherited strategies and hedonic feedback, which happens during the lifetime. So there are some inherited skills, some species-specific strategies, such as all rats now, they don't have to learn this, but if you put a new food in front of them that they'd not seen before, they'll just try a little bit of it and then come back later. If it doesn't harm them, they'll come back and finish it off. So many generations of rats have been poisoned deliberately by humans that this is now an inbuilt strategy to not consume new foods without checking on whether it's safe. Then there are learned skills. So there's a lot of learning about self-medication strategies from peers, from the family group and from the local group that they grow up with. And you've got to work, and of course, this is completely absent in livestock and companion animals, that they're not growing up in peer groups most of the time. And then we've got what we can see in even with our own situation is this thing called hedonic feedback, which is that you eat something or you do something and you feel better, so therefore you learn by association to do it again. And you eat something or do something and you feel worse, and by association you learn not to do it again. So it's combinations of ways that they discover or know how to do what they. There's also these inbuilt physiological changes that happen when animals are sick. So, for example, our taste preferences change, and they've noticed this with primates, is that they're far more tolerant of bitters when they feel sick, and when they start to feel better, they don't want to eat bitter tasting compounds. And we still have that. Our taste preferences change when we're sick, and those taste preferences can guide us towards finding something that's more appropriate for our state of health at the time. So in captivity, we're still talking about wild animals. I'm not talking about domesticated livestock or pets yet, but in captivity, wild animals often get sick, and it's because their health is embedded in their natural ecosystem. And as soon as you take them out of their natural ecosystem, they're missing something, and they're missing something, and we don't know what it is. And the examples I've got here, a gorilla, a mountain gorilla. If you bring the mountain gorilla into captivity, one of the things they start to do is to dig at the concrete of their confinement, and they'll dig so hard that their fingers will bleed. And this has been described as an aberrant behaviour. It's a kind of like self-harming because they're so unhappy in captivity. But if you study mountain gorillas in the wild, one of the things they do when they're not feeling well is dig down to volcanic rock and crumble it up in their hands to make a powder and eat it as a medicine for neutralizing toxins in their gut. So a lot of behaviors that we assume are kind of aberrant behaviors, they're kind of weird behaviors due to depression or confinement, can actually just be attempts at self-medication. So in the top right here, I've got a picture of a long-legged fox, and these come from Brazil. And again, when people took these long-legged foxes into captivity, into a zoo, they found them really difficult to keep alive. They were giving them all the nutrients they need, everything they could think of that the fox might need, but they were still dying. And they found that they were dying of this one particular worm called a giant kidney worm. And the trouble is that the giant kidney worm is endemic in this area, so they didn't know how they could treat it, because if they gave them enough medicine to kill the worm, then it was going to kill the fox. So it was a problem keeping them alive. And when they studied them in the wild, they noticed that the long-legged fox was going out of its way to eat a constant supply of this particular local tomato, which had a reputation for being poisonous. And the amount of this plant that's a member of the tomato family, the amount of this plant varied through the year, but the fox always ate a constant amount all year round. And of course, when they fed this plant to their captive foxes, they discovered that it kept the giant kidney worm under control. So it didn't kill it, but it allowed the fox to survive. So, health completely embedded into the local environment. Very difficult to take animals out of the local environment and expect them to stay healthy. Okay, domesticated species. The problem we've got here is that they're not selectively bred for their ability to self-regulate. Like us, they've lost most of their know-how that their ancestors had. They don't have access to the nutrients and medicines in which they evolved, and so their choices are very restricted, and they're completely reliant on us for health and welfare. What can we do then to look after animals in our care? I think in the long run, it's about providing opportunities for learning from others who know better. So more emphasis on this family group and peer group situation, not removing youngsters too soon from their family and peers. But the long and the short of it is choices for trial and error and self-regulation. And I don't mean just giving them a choice of 2 different types of cat food. I mean providing a whole range of aromatic and medicinal herbs in the garden that they can rummage about in and find what they want and roll in. Providing clays, access to clays. You can buy clay blocks, bentonite clay blocks from herbal suppliers, and allowing them to eat mechanical scours if they so want. It's not wrong for them to chew on things that are indigestible. Obviously, if they're not natural things, so chewing on plastic and swallowing plastic's not good, but it is likely to be an attempt at self-medicating, trying to get something indigestible in. And focusing on this idea of skin rubs, aromatics and dustings and so on. So it's not always about medicines, but allowing this whole range of health maintenance opportunities. I've got in there toxic substances equal medicinal substances. Yeah, it's often a matter of dosage. So as we had that example with the deer, if you totally eradicate all the potentially toxic weeds from the pasture, then you are also removing all the potential for self-medication. Okay, so as you know, this kind of information that people are researching has relevance for management of animals in our care, for livestock and for our companion animals. My book is available in a range of languages, from German to Korean, Japanese, and I hope you enjoy. Any questions? I've got a website, cindyengel.com. Welcome to have feedback and to update our knowledge. Thank you.